Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. We're really happy you could join us for today's webinar on making the most of floodplain buyouts. My name is Rebecca Kisslinger. I'm a science and policy analyst at the Environmental Law Institute, and I direct our wetlands program. For those of you not familiar with ELI, we're a nonprofit law and policy research organization based in Washington, D.C. So today's webinar, we're going to talk about making the most of floodplain buyouts. My colleague, David Salveson from the University of North Carolina Institute for the Environment, and I will be sharing with you the results of some work that we've been doing over the past few years on the use and management of floodplain buyout sites. We're going to start by giving you a bit of background on floodplain buyout programs. We're going to talk then about what we've learned about current use and management and what communities are doing on these properties. And then we're going to finish with some management strategies and identify some opportunities for communities using these properties and some challenges and considerations that we've identified and some resources that may help communities address those challenges. So thank you so much for joining us. Just a few logistics before we get started. Right now all of the attendees are on mute, but we really hope that you will participate in today's webinar and ask us lots of questions or provide some feedback. We'd love to hear your feedback. And you can do that by going to your question bar on the GoToWebinar control panel, which is likely on the right-hand side of your screen. You can also raise your hand by clicking on that hand icon on the bump out from that control panel, and then you can ask your question live. But I'd love for you all to practice using that question bar and let us know where you are. We'd love to hear who is in the audience. So let us know where you are and how many people are listening to us from your office. Excellent. Great. I'm glad you can hear us, and I'm getting a few responses in now, so thanks. So please use that question bar to ask us questions. If you're having any technical questions or you're finding yourself with no audio, please email Nora at the email address on the screen, and we'll do our very best to address those technical questions. And with that, enjoy the presentation. We're going to get started, and I'm going to turn it over to David to get us started on some background and on the floodplain buyout programs. So
all right, thanks, Rebecca, and thanks everybody for joining us. Rebecca, just a quick question. Are we going to take questions as we go or hold them for the end?
Thanks. I think we'll hold questions for the end unless there's something that folks want clarification, and I may jump in.
Okay, I'm not sure I can see questions anyway, but so that'll work out better if we hold them to the end. Anyway, well, what I thought I would do, since I don't know everybody's background, I thought I'd give a very brief introduction to hazard mitigation and something called the disaster cycle, which anybody who's ever been involved with emergency management should be familiar with. So people often talk, emergency managers often talk about the cycle as being having three pieces or three parts. One is preparation, which could mean opening shelters, evacuating an area, putting sandbags along the river. If you're on the coast, it might be putting plywood on windows. After that comes response, which could involve search and rescue, providing shelter, food, water, cleaning supplies, and debris removal to people. And then recovery usually involves, getting the utilities up and running again and rebuilding. And so there's a cycle here. So you have a disaster, people prepare for it, they respond, they recover, and then you start the cycle all over again. But then starting around, I guess around the late 80s, early 90s, people started really pressing for something called mitigation to break this cycle. Next slide, Rebecca. And so mitigation comes in many forms. I'll talk about some of them. One way of mitigating the damages to, in this case, flooding, is to elevate a home or a structure. This is from eastern North Carolina. Now there's land use planning. You could use zoning, for example, to use floodplain zoning to zone certain areas for either low density or set certain standards for the type of development that occurs there. Same thing with building codes. You could have certain standards to make sure a house could withstand a certain kind of flood or an earthquake zone, a certain amount of shaking. I've looked at infrastructure policy and how communities can discourage people from building in hazard-prone areas by not extending water and sewer lines to those areas. Can work quite well. At the federal level, there's something called the Coastal Barrier Resources Act, which uses the same approach. And then lastly, what Rebecca and I have looked at, which is acquisition or buyouts, which I'll talk about in a minute. I haven't included another big one on here, which is used, I guess, holding back the floodwaters through flood walls or levees or things like that. But that's another big part of mitigation. It's just not something we'll talk about today. Next slide, please. So the acquisition or buyout of homes goes back at least to the early 70s. There were several programs, mostly in the Midwest, to buy entire towns or entire downtowns and relocate people on property to higher ground. Since 1993, which is when FEMA really got into mitigation and buyouts in a big way after the huge floods in the upper Midwest, FEMA has purchased somewhere between 20,000 properties across the country. Since most recently, after Hurricane Sandy, I was just at a conference last week, and there was a panel talking about buyouts as a result of Hurricane Sandy. The New York and New Jersey region have purchased close to 1,500 homes as a result of the buyout. And these homes are not cheap. Any of those are along the New Jersey coast, which is quite a popular place for people to buy second homes and rent them out. Or in the New York metropolitan area, the homes are not cheap, particularly in places like Staten Island or Long Island. Next slide, Rebecca. So there are several programs that can be used for mitigation, in particular for buyouts. The biggest one is the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, in which a community can get 15 to 20% of the total amount of federal disaster assistance funds that are used for that particular community. And that money can be used to elevate homes or for buyouts. And I'll talk a little bit more about the HMGP or Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. The other big one is the Community Development Block Grant, which is has been used increasingly. It comes with fewer strings, I might say, than the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, but it's also triggered by a federally declared disaster, as is the HMGP. And the money is supposed to be used to benefit primarily low-income residents, and that could include using the money for buyouts. Next slide. So the HMGP and the CDBG money, Community Development Block Grant money, are triggered or made available after a presidential declaration. That is, after the president declares a disaster large enough that the federal government is going to step in to help out state and local governments. The money is distributed not directly to individual homeowners, at least for buyouts. It goes to the state and then to the local government and is administered through them. In most cases, the local government has to pay a 25% match, but there have been instances when the disaster is so severe or a community is so overwhelmed that the federal government will waive the local match or even allow community development block grant funds to be used for the match. The buyouts are strictly voluntary. I don't know of any cases where homeowners were forced to sell either through eminent domain or some other approach. And they're paid the pre-flood fair market value for their home. So assessors are brought in to evaluate what the homes were worth before they were flooded. So it's very fair in that sense that people aren't forced out of their home. They're paid pre-flood fair market value for the home. And in some cases even given an incentive to move somewhere else, which I'll get to in a minute. And then after the homes are purchased, at least under the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, the homes are demolished, or they can be relocated, and that land has to stay undeveloped in perpetuity. Can't build a home or any kind of structure on there. There are a few exceptions. You could build, picnic facilities. You can build bathrooms, public bathrooms. You can build, tennis courts, things like that. But no homes can be built there. Next slide. So some of the advantages, the buyouts overall save money. In fact, FEMA requires that a community go through what's called a very detailed benefit cost analysis to prove or demonstrate that the benefits over the long term will be greater than or at least equal to the cost. And I should mention that FEMA now allows the value of properties for ecosystem services to be included in that calculation, which is a big change. I think that happened in 2013. Anyway, they save money because those homes are once those homes are removed or demolished, they're not there to be damaged or destroyed during the next flood. So there's a big, what FEMA calls an avoided cost. And in fact, they've done several studies of avoided costs. So those areas are permanently protected and those homes will never be flooded again. It also creates open space, can help reduce the risk of future floods, and in some cases provides areas for habitat either intentionally or otherwise, and I think we'll get into that later in the presentation. Next slide, Rebecca. So some of the disadvantages, I mentioned that buying homes along the coast of New Jersey or New York even can be particularly expensive, and you run through the money quite quickly. Buyouts take a ridiculous amount of time. There's sometimes 3 or 4, even 5 years. There's a buyout going on in North Carolina in a small community in Princeville, called Princeville, along the Tar River in eastern North Carolina. They were flooded from Hurricane Matthew back in October, and they're just now taking applications from homeowners for the buyout. So that's how many months? I have to count my fingers. November, December, January. So like 5 or 6 months just to get started. Those applications then have to go to the state, then to FEMA regional, and then FEMA headquarters. So it takes a long time for the buyouts. And in the meantime, people are living in hotels or living with friends or families. And in many cases, they'll simply get tired of the indecision and they'll go back to their houses, fix them up, and move back in. Many of the communities Rebecca and I have talked to talk about their concerns over a loss of tax base. So if homeowners move out of the community, they'll lose those property taxes that would otherwise have been paid. I was interviewing some emergency managers and other officials in Bergen County, New Jersey, which is very close to New York City. Homes there are very expensive, and they were extremely reluctant to buy any homes that were flooded because of the loss of tax base. I think they bought 2 homes, even though quite a few were flooded. And they told me that if every home you buy, that's a loss of at least $10,000 per year over the life of that house. So if you multiply that by, say, 100 homes, you can see how that adds up very quickly. Neighborhood disruption, you can imagine the neighborhood you live in, if, say, half or a third of the homes were purchased in kind of a pockmarked pattern, you'd have all these vacant houses spread throughout the neighborhood, and it really disrupts things physically and even socially. There's a neighborhood in North Carolina in Kinston called Lincoln City. At least it was a neighborhood. And almost the entire neighborhood was purchased as part of the buyout, and all those homes were demolished. And every year, the people who used to live in Lincoln City come back to Kinston for a reunion. So there are these strong ties to place in some of these communities, which is one of the reasons why some people decide not to participate, which gets to the next point. Probably the biggest problem with buyouts is that since they're voluntary, not everybody wants to participate. So you might have a homeowner who says, my grandfather built this house, or I was born in this house, or I have nowhere else to go. I can't afford to buy a home somewhere else. So they will decline to participate in the buyout. And that makes it difficult for communities to do anything with the properties that they do acquire because they have this patchwork pattern of properties. And then lastly, in smaller communities, particularly those of low wealth, often get saddled with the cost of maintaining the properties after they're acquired, and they don't really have the capacity or the resources to deal with these properties. So many will just let them go to seed, if you will, or they will plant them in grass and then just mow them every now and then because they can't do anything else with them. So that's a big issue that we've seen time and time again. Next slide, please.
Okay, I think this is me. So thanks, David. So we were really interested in, once the community goes through this whole process of acquiring sites, the structures are removed and the properties must remain in open space. What's happening? What are communities doing? How are they being used? Can we provide some models or examples for other communities across the country that might be interested in doing more with their floodplain buyout properties? And then we wanted to examine a little bit more of those challenges that David mentioned that communities are facing with the buyout program and with restoring or maintaining these properties. So our research had 2 sort of primary components. One, we reached out to communities primarily in 4 states, Minnesota, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and New Jersey, all states with many buyouts, with many communities that have had quite a number of buyouts, and where the state was interested in learning more about those communities. So we reached out to communities in those states and some others to ask about the buyout process and what's happening with the sites now. We wanted to know the size of acquisitions, funding, current management, if there were any selection criteria that were used to target or prioritize funds, any incentives that were used to encourage more people to sell, and a little bit more about those social costs and benefits that David mentioned. In addition to that assessment of communities, we also took a bit of a deeper dive in about 14 communities that David's going to discuss in a bit. He's going to talk about a few of them. And we did a number of local case studies, and those can be found on our website at the right. We went into those communities. We talked with the local government agencies about the buyout process and current management of the sites, and we developed case studies to talk about the process, what's happening, and to show some maps of the location of the buyouts. So based on this research, we've developed an action guide, which includes recommendations for local governments on how to make the most of floodplain buyouts, what other communities are doing, and what resources might be available for maintaining, restoring, or providing other community amenities on floodplain buyout sites. We're also working on a number of research briefs to address some of those challenges, a funding research brief, and one on prioritizing future buyouts, and I'll discuss those a little bit later. I want to acknowledge our funding sources. They provided excellent support, the McKnight Foundation, US EPA Wetland Program Development Grant, and the New York Community Trust continue to support this project as we move forward. So what are communities doing with the acquired properties, and what are some examples of what other communities might do? So what we learned in our research is there's a real range of current use. A lot of communities told us that their buyouts are made in open space, which is obviously a very broad category, open space, but it really encompasses a lot of uses. Some of the properties are mowed either by the local agency or by neighbors. And a lot of properties are just in kind of an unmanaged state. So many communities have decided, let's just allow natural vegetation to reclaim these sites. They're not really managing them, but they're allowing that natural floodplain vegetation to come back in. We also heard that there's a lot of these sites in recreation uses, parks or boat docks, trails, frisbee golf courses, other kinds of community amenities like the band shell you see on the bottom right. That's a large park in Austin, Minnesota, and David will talk a little bit about that. A few communities told us they've restored some habitats, floodplains, wetlands, or wildlife habitat. The picture in the bottom middle is a picture of Montevideo, Minnesota, where they've restored some 25 acres of native prairie habitat, and you can see that's still in a place where there's homes of folks that have decided they don't want to leave yet, and they're still running the utilities down the middle of this restored site. But there are options for communities to use those sites in creative ways. And David's going to go into a little bit more detail on some of these properties, or some of these communities. So there's a range of things happening, but in a lot of communities we heard they would like to do more, but there's a lot of obstacles. And as David mentioned, funding is the number one. We heard it from I think every community that we reached out to. Many told us there just isn't funding available to restore or develop community amenities on floodplain buyout sites. They just don't know where to go to get that money. As David mentioned, there's the federal floodplain buyout programs only provide funding for purchasing the property, removing the structure, sometimes grading the site or seeding it with grass seed, and then that's it. So the local government is left with these properties and no money to manage them or to develop them as a community amenity. So that's one major challenge. Another one, as David mentioned, was this patchwork distribution of parcels, which really limits what can be done on these sites in terms of large-scale projects. But we're going to talk about some opportunities for smaller-scale projects that we've seen in the communities that we've been to and that may provide some examples for other places. Other obstacles include cost and capacity, and the local government just doesn't have the capacity to do it. They barely have capacity to go out and monitor these sites in some of the smaller communities that we've seen. Existing infrastructure, as I showed you in the picture earlier, roads, utility poles, things that still remain. What do you do with those once you have the structures removed from the buyouts? So now I'm going to turn it back to David to talk a little bit more in detail of some of the communities that we've been interested in and working with on this project.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. Rebecca, I'm not sure you mentioned where on your website people can find some of these documents you mentioned. So for those of you who are interested, you can go to ELI for environmentalalinstitute.org, look under Access Our Resources, and then search under Research Reports. There you'll find all the case studies we've written for the buyouts. You'll find the action guide and lots of other good stuff. So that's eli.org, Access Our Resources, Research Reports.
Okay, great, thanks. And I can post that link in the chat as well, so folks, you can look at your GoToWebinar control panel and find it there. Okay,
so we visited close to 20 sites and wrote case studies for, I think, around 15 or 16. I'm a bit parochial. I'd like to give you an example of some of the sites here in North Carolina, Rocky Mount, Charlotte, and Kinston, and then talk a bit about Austin, Minnesota, which my students got to go to. I didn't get to see it, but I can tell you a little bit about it. Next slide, please. So Rocky Mount's a smallish community, about 55, 60,000 people located in eastern North Carolina along the Tar River. Has a long history of flooding, the most severe of which was in 1999, although I think it also got flooded back in October. And the city purchased, largely using hazard mitigation grant funds, about 450 homes or so. And they put them to a variety of uses, some of which I think Rebecca's already mentioned. I'd like to contrast Rocky Mount, what they've done with the town a little further downstream, which is Greenville, not one of our case studies, but Greenville pretty much just took all the isolated properties and leased them out to adjacent property owners for $1 per year. People have done everything from parked cars to trailers to small gardens there, but they really haven't done much except just to lease them out to neighbors. Rocky Mount, on the other hand, next slide, please, has been quite creative. You saw the slide on the left. That's a Frisbee golf park. They've also have a dog park. Look at my notes here for a second. Yeah, they have a small greenway, dog park, and a number of other uses as well. So I was really impressed with what Rocky Mount has done with the limited resources that they had to create a variety of parks that not only reduce the risk in the future, but provide an amenity for the local community. Next slide, please. So here's a shot of Rocky Mount. The parcels are outlined, the buyout parcels are outlined in that kind of greenish color. The red is the 500-year floodplain. And you can see the scattershot approach of these parcels, which, again, makes it difficult for the city to do much with these things on a large scale. It's hard to have a greenway along the river, for example. Next slide, please. This is a shot of the same area pretty much, but the floodplain shown in blue is much more clearly marked. And one of the things we looked at in a small way was how much new development has happened after the buyout. So a community removes homes to reduce its future risk of flood or flooding. Yet on the one hand, yet on the other hand, they're approving new development in the flood hazard areas to undermine whatever gains in risk reduction they achieved through the buyout. So the small boxes marked in, I guess that's purple, show where new construction has occurred just in the 3-year period after the buyout. Next slide, please. And this is not uncommon. So I want to jump to Charlotte, the western part of the state, or southwestern. Charlotte's unusual in that it doesn't have to rely on a federal disaster to trigger the release of grant funds from the federal government. Back in the 90s, after a series of floods, Charlotte decided it needed to take control of its flooding. And so it created a stormwater utility, and they charge a fee that's about $10 to $15 per year per month per house. And that generates about $4 million a year that can be used for mitigation. And so this allows Charlotte to be patient and strategic in the properties it buys. It's not buying them right after a disaster. They don't have to rush in and try to find some people to sell. They can try to buy entire streets or entire neighborhoods, and they can be strategic in the sense that they can try to buy areas that will add to an existing park or greenway, or maybe provide some green space in a part of the city that lacks green space. So they've used their buyouts for as you can see, for community gardens, for greenways, for river restoration, for all kinds of things. Next slide, please. Now we'll jump to Kinston, which is also a community with a long history of flooding, the worst of which was after Hurricane Fran in '96 and Hurricane Floyd in 1999. The city bought over 400 homes, and then there were several bought by the county as well. One large area that was purchased was a neighborhood called Lincoln City. It was a predominantly African-American neighborhood purchased right along the river, and I'll talk more about that later. One of the interesting things, two of the interesting things that happened in Kinston was that the state recognized that many people were reluctant to take part in the buyout because they were unable to buy an equivalent-sized home anywhere else in the community for the amount of money they were going to get pre-flood for their existing home. So the state provided what's called SARF funding, State Acquisition and Relocation Fund, to try to address this or meet this gap in the difference between the value of their old house or their existing house before it flooded and the cost of a new house somewhere else in the community. Usually always costs more when you're buying land outside the floodplain. And then the city also provided up to $10,000 to get people or to encourage people to relocate within the city limits, which gets back to that issue I raised before about cities' concern about the loss of tax base. And it turns out that most of the buyout participants in Kinston did end up relocating within the city. In some cases, they took existing houses and moved them to vacant lots for infill. In other cases, they just demolished the home and gave people money, plus this added incentive to stay within the community. Next slide, please. So here's a map of Kinston. You can see there are some clusters where a large buyout occurred. The three really large parcels in the bottom right-hand side were, I think those were, there were a couple junkyards there and a wastewater treatment facility and an old dump. And the city bought those out, and that land is now vacant. But you can see that the area in blue, it's kind of mixed blue-green, is the 100-year floodplain. Kinston also has, I've also identified on this map, the priority wetlands, which overlap extensively with the 100-year floodplain. Next slide, please. One of the disappointing things about Kinston is that they have this huge chunk of land, about 500 acres, I believe, or 500 parcels, I should say, that they haven't done anything with. The roads are still there, which provides easy access for illegal dumping. Some old homes have been abandoned and there are trees growing through the roofs. It's a real opportunity for them to do something with this land along the river, either try to restore it for habitat or build a greenway or whatever. But the city just doesn't have the resources or the political will to do anything. So this is what you get instead. Next slide, please. I'll jump now to Minnesota, a place I know a little less about because I didn't get to visit there, but Austin, Minnesota is on the, is it the Cedar River? Right on the border with Minnesota, with Iowa, sorry. And they've had, as you can see, floods dating back to 1945. Every couple of years it seems like they get hammered. And the floods in 2008, 2010 were some of the worst. So Austin had, since 1978, started buying properties, and they're approaching 400 total properties. The unique thing about Austin is that, like Charlotte, they don't have to rely entirely on the federal government or a presidential disaster declaration in order to buy homes. They have their own source of funding through a local option sales tax, which brings in about $1 million a year for mitigation. They've also gotten some funding from the state government as well to purchase these properties. Next slide, please. The other interesting thing about Austin is that they have sold at auction some of the homes that were purchased as a buyout, and they use the proceeds or profits from those sales to go back into the kitty to buy some more homes. I included this map just so you can see how extensive the floodplain, the 100-year floodplain shown in blue is here, and also the intense clustering of parcels along a couple areas along the floodplain. And that really provides excellent opportunities for them to do something with a large enough buyout site, either make a big park or restore wetlands or put habitat in there or whatever. It's not quite as scattered as in some of the other communities. And as Rebecca said, some of the areas in Austin were dedicated for prairie and wetland restoration. Next slide. This is a map that was developed in Austin a long time ago, well, after the 93 floods, to show what they had hoped to happen along the river, which is to build this central park. And I have a couple shots. Next slide, Rebecca. Just to show what has happened here, I think you may have seen this already. One is an amphitheater with a nice flat park, grassy area around it. The other one is a bike and pedestrian trail through the grassy area along the river as well. So they've done a wonderful job in moving homes out of the flood hazard areas with their own money to create these community assets, as well as restoring at least one area for a wetland. Next slide. Oh, I wanted to add one more thing. I don't have a photo of it, but there was a church in the floodplain in Austin that was left standing, although it was damaged. So they took out part of the structure. I think they took the doors and the windows out, but the structure is still there. They flood-proofed it in such a way that it can withstand getting wet without being damaged. And now that's used by the community for weddings and festivals and graduation parties and things like that. So if you Googled Austin Church in floodplain, you might find it. But I thought that was a novel approach to taking this one facility that was still standing. Would have cost them a lot of money to demolish and move, and instead they left it there and turned it into a community asset. All right, Rebecca, am I doing this slide?
Yes.
Okay. So what we learned is there are tremendous opportunities to restore sites, either for some kind of parkland or recreation facility, campground, or whatever, but also for wetlands or to allow the land to revert back to being a floodplain again. But how the properties are used varies considerably from one community to the next, depending on things like the scale of the buyout, the resources available to the community, and their capacity to do something with, that is to manage the site. I mentioned aggregate risk, and I showed an example of Rocky Mount, where in some cases, on the one hand, communities are removing houses to reduce their vulnerability or risk to future flooding. On the other hand, they're allowing new development to occur, which seems kind of crazy, but that's what's happening. There are some pretty big challenges with buyouts, and I think the biggest one has to do with getting the fact that not everybody is willing to sell. Not everybody wants to move. And again, I talked to some people in the buyout areas, and they said, you know, where am I going to go? I can't find another house, a comparable house, anywhere else in the community that I could afford for the amount of money I'll get for my property. So they stay, or they have some other cultural or emotional or historic ties to the community, so they decide to stay there. So you end up with this patchwork, or some people call it a snaggletooth distribution of properties, which makes it really difficult to do anything with them on a large scale. We talked a little bit about funding. Some communities are funding things locally, but funding for not just the acquisition, but for the maintenance remains a challenge for many communities, particularly in smaller areas. There are several rural communities in North Carolina who view the buyout properties as nothing more than a burden on their scarce resources, and they would rather have the federal government or somebody else take over the funding for maintenance, or not participate in the buyout at all. And the timing can be a burden as well. It takes far too long to get a buyout implemented. And as Rebecca said, many communities simply don't have the capacity to implement or manage a buyout. So that remains a challenge.
Great. Thanks, David. So I'm going to conclude the presentation with bringing together what we've learned through our research about management strategies, kind of summarize what we've learned and what opportunities might be for communities, and then some final considerations on challenges. So I mentioned the action guide that's based on our research. It's designed to help communities across the country leverage these hazard mitigation sites. We're really interested in this last piece with this action guide. What do you do once you have the sites? How do you find funding to manage them? What are the opportunities to manage them? So that's what this action guide is, the focus of the action guide. We highlight some management approaches. We talk about a decision-making process for identifying opportunities through a community-based process, and also for implementing projects. And then we talk about the challenges and considerations. So management strategy, this kind of sums up what we've been talking about in terms of our examples. Management options, as David said, are really going to vary depending on the location of the properties, the capacity of the government, surrounding land use, all kinds of factors will determine what can be done on the sites. But one of the main factors is this context, this sort of spatial context of the buyout properties. Are you in a patchwork, as we've discussed many times, or is it more of a holdout situation where the community has actually bought a big chunk of properties that are adjacent to each other, but there's just one or two people who've decided they don't want to go, they're staying. There's a good example in Kenosha County, Wisconsin, where they bought properties all along an entire peninsula jutting out into the Fox River, except for the very last one at the very end of the peninsula. And they're just not willing to go, and so the county still plows the road and maintains the utilities down to this home for that last holdout. So there's a number of examples of those kinds of situations. And then there's this comprehensive situation where maybe you're really lucky and you get a whole neighborhood to go and you have a big piece of land for a bigger restoration project or other kind of project. So I'm going to go through a few options based on our research that we're developing for these different contexts. So patchwork, what can you do on a patchwork site? We've seen some examples of the community gardens. One home or one property within two adjacent properties or a few properties together next to some remaining homes might be a good place for a community garden, like we saw in one video and Charlotte. It could offer the community a good green space to gather. The produce could be used for community events. In more urban areas, maybe pocket parks, maybe another good choice. Native plant gardens, where that could be maintained by the neighbors, and a neighbor may decide to maintain the adjacent property and plant native plants that could be valuable for pollinators. So pollinator habitat may be another good use for these kinds of sites to support local bees and other species. And then maybe rain gardens or other small-scale green infrastructure could provide a way to improve some small-scale stormwater management in communities that find this patchwork context. So in these holdout situations, again, you might have a big swath of properties, adjacent properties, and there may be some opportunities for some habitat restoration or other development. We saw these kind of contexts in Austin, Montevideo, Kenosha, as I mentioned, and other areas of our case studies in other communities. You might not be able to see large-scale restoration efforts, at least not now until the holdouts decide to go, but other opportunities for significant projects may still exist. Like I mentioned, the Montevideo example where they had that 25 acres of native prairie restoration, and that was kind of wove through a neighborhood where they still had a few people who have remained, and they're still trying to find the funds to buy some of those. There's still some willing sellers in that neighborhood, and there's a few holdouts. There are, of course, a lot of different kinds of restoration actions that might occur on these kinds of sites, from no intervention, as we've mentioned a number of times, where you have the community allows the native vegetation to reclaim the sites, to some more minimal action. Maybe there's some invasive species management. Maybe there's a community day where there's some cleanup. And then you can go all the way up to restoration or rehabilitation in a full-scale effort. So there's lots of different kinds of restoration efforts that might be possible. Other opportunities in the holdout situation might include linear parks or greenways or other kinds of recreation or community amenities. And the final case is this comprehensive case where you might have a really big swath of land with no properties and a real opportunity for some floodplain, wetland, or habitat restoration. These are rare. We didn't see too many of these in our experience, but they do exist, and over time, as more homeowners decide to leave some of these areas, especially the holdout areas, you may see more of these kind of comprehensive or large-scale opportunities for restoration or community amenities. So I'm going to finish with these challenges or considerations and mention some of the resources that we've pulled together in the action guide to address some of these challenges. The first we've talked about a lot today is funding, both for funding restoration activities and also for more acquisitions. So we're working on a research brief, as I mentioned way back in the beginning, and we're trying to pull together as many examples from across the country of different financing and funding tools and incentive programs, both for acquiring properties and for restoring sites. So we're looking at examples of places where communities have been creative with their non-federal match, for funding buyouts completely and for incentive programs. So David mentioned the Austin local option sales tax has been very successful in funding buyouts. And he also mentioned some of the incentive programs, the Kinston program, where they've provided incentives for property owners to stay within the community, and that helps them to be more willing sellers, but also helps the community, as David mentioned, keep tax base and a community feel. There's a similar program in New York called New York's Rising Buyout and Acquisition Program that was established after Superstorm Sandy, and that program's offered incentives that total as much as 15% of the pre-storm fair market value, and that can be a real incentive to get folks to be, willing participants in a buyout program if you're adding that percentage on top of the purchase price. The funding for restoration and management is a little bit stickier, and we're still looking for some good examples for funding programs that have funded these kinds of projects and buyouts themselves. So our research brief, we're going to pull together some of those examples as models for other places, and we're also going to look at some programs that are not targeted to buyouts or maybe haven't been used for buyouts yet, but may be available some other state and local program funding. So we're working on that, and that should be completed in the next month or so. We're now reaching out to a number of programs across the country to get some more examples. So if you have any, please let us know. Another really important consideration is how to get buy-in from neighbors for projects on these sites, because as we've mentioned a number of times, a lot of times there's neighbors, the neighborhood didn't all go together, and there's still people living in these areas, and it's really important to get community participation in any of these projects. It could involve, small site-scale management of a garden, adjacent to a homeowner's property, all the way up to a community-scale participation planning process, and how you determine the best use of those sites. So engaging community members in these planning processes is a real key, I think, and we've included in the action guide some community engagement and outreach resources that are available and may help communities at least think through what the process might look like. Then what about permits? So, these are projects that may require permits, licenses, or approvals. You may need an Army Corps of Engineer permit for projects in a wetland or other water. You may need a stormwater discharge permit, or to show that you're consistent with the local land use plan, or an herbicide permit or license. So there are a number of potential permits, local, state, and federal programs that may be relevant for these projects. And this list is not comprehensive, nor will every project need to address all of these different permits or approvals. But it really is important to have communities reach out to the relevant agencies to make sure they know well in advance what kinds of permits might come up. So then the next three kind of go together, I think, maintenance, partnerships, and transferring the property. So I think maintenance is a really important consideration. The long-term management and maintenance responsibilities are going to vary, of course, with what happens on the site, but they can't be ignored. You need to have a provision for how these sites are going to be maintained over the long term once you've restored them or provided a community amenity. And that's really important, not only to lay out the kind of actions that are going to be needed, but what the costs are and how much that's going to cost, and that should be built into a project cost. And then to the decision making for the project. In some cases, local governments are going to have that capacity in-house to be able to maintain the sites. They have a parks department that maintains the parks, or other a public works department, or other kinds of agencies that may be able to maintain habitats. But a lot of local governments, especially in small communities, may need to look to outside groups for partnerships. As I mentioned, public works department are often the entities overseeing the acquired properties. Parks and Rec departments often oversee these properties once the local government takes control. Sometimes the emergency management department, or the sheriff, or somebody in that department still has responsibility for these sites. And as David mentioned, sometimes that turns into a burden, and they don't have even the capacity to go out to monitor the sites to make sure that there's no violations to the deed restrictions. So here's where I think partnerships become really important. Maintenance is one area where partners are important. Partners, though, can provide a real range of roles in any project, helping to plan future acquisitions, helping sellers navigate the buyout process, planning for the management activities, participating in the restoration or development of sites, and providing that long-term management or maintenance. Partners can be a whole range of different kinds of groups: local, state, federal agencies, non-governmental organizations, community groups. But I think the point here is that many of these community environmental groups are not aware of the potential opportunities with working with communities on these sites. There hasn't been a lot of communication among the agencies that are overseeing floodplain buyout sites and maybe thinking about opportunities for what they want to do there. And other groups where their goals might align. There might be a conservation group who is looking for a land trust that's looking for a floodplain site that they could manage or help with restoration planning. So we've put together a report on strategic partnerships, and it was focused mostly on wetland restoration. But I think that in general, the kind of places where partners can play a role in these projects is more broad than just for wetland restoration. Partners can provide information and expertise, that provide funds, engage with stakeholders. A lot of times partners know that, or have existing relationship with stakeholders that may be important or valuable in projects on buyout sites. And then again, take on maintenance, management, or monitoring responsibilities away from a community can really lift a burden and provide a win-win for both sides. And that sort of gets into this last of these three in transferring the properties. After a buyout, when the open space deed restrictions are attached to the property, the community can lease the property to a new user, or they can outright transfer the property to a qualified public or nonprofit owner. And the FEMA regulations define what qualified means. So the lease or title transfer can make sense if the partners are willing to take on the management responsibilities, or if it can help increase stakeholder participation or support of the neighbors. So transferring the property can make sense, and I think David mentioned a few examples of that. Before, though, this can happen, both leases and transfers of properties have to have FEMA approval. And even if money is not involved in the transaction, the new user or owner is responsible for the property, and then that the property adheres to the deed restrictions. And that includes the responsibility for the 3-year open space certification that is required under the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program for open space monitoring, to make sure that nothing's being built that shouldn't be built on these properties. Okay, and then the final one is we've talked quite a bit about prioritizing future buyouts and how a community can figure out how to invest future dollars that may be available for floodplain buyouts. A lot of times there's more willing sellers, not always, but a lot of times there's more willing sellers in a community than there is money to buy homes. And so many communities have come up with some criteria that they use to prioritize which properties they're going to purchase with the money that they've received. So sometimes it's based on impacts to the property. Sometimes it's based on whether it's a primary residence or a rental or a seasonal residence, or whether it's a residential or a commercial property. So we were really interested in kind of digging in a little bit more into these criteria that local governments are using to prioritize future buyouts, or to prioritize how they're going to allocate money for buyouts. And so we reviewed local, state, and federal guidance to come up with this list of criteria that are being used, including financing and grant specifications, so what's required of the grant programs, disaster characteristics, whether the property is located in the 100-year floodplain or currently threatened by erosion, damages, costs, and losses. And then some communities are also include landscape and environmental benefits as part of their prioritization criteria. So there's some of the communities that are doing that, but there really are few communities that have engaged in any upfront planning prior to the disaster occurring. So there aren't a lot of communities that are saying, let's sit down and figure out where we want to buy the next set of buyouts to address our flooding issues, and then also to provide some multiple benefits for the community. Maybe it's habitat. Maybe we want more property next to this park. There are few communities doing that. Kenosha County is one example where they actually prioritized or did a whole planning process to figure out where are we going to buy these sites, and they're moving along through that planning process several decades later and still acquiring homes through multiple different funding sources. So what we're doing with prioritizing future buyouts is we're coming up with a set of criteria based on a review of different planning, different kinds of plans, comprehensive plans, conservation plans, and to come up with a set of criteria that communities may use to prioritize future buyouts, in addition to some of these other criteria related to the grant specifications and flood risk. So that's going to come out in maybe another couple of months. Okay. So finally, I just wanted to talk about what we're up to now and what the next steps are. We are currently looking for 2 or 3 communities to work with us on kind of a pilot planning process. And the idea would be to identify the communities that have a number of buyouts but that are really interested in figuring out what they can do with them. And we'll host a meeting or a workshop with the local officials, the neighbors in the area of the buyout, and other interested stakeholders, and then come up with some potential opportunities for the use of that site and what the community wants to see on that site and what makes sense for the local government. We'll prepare a report illustrating this use, and then if possible, we'll identify some potential funding sources that may be able to provide funds for these uses. So that's ongoing. We hope to have those complete over the rest of the summer. And with that, we're at the end. Thank you again for joining us today. We think there's a lot of opportunity and room for local governments to form partnerships and to provide some assistance to local governments on this process. And we're really interested in hearing your thoughts and questions on the presentation. So I do have some questions. David, do you want to add anything before I get to the questions?
No, let's. We don't have much time, so might as well just jump right to the question.
Okay. So the first question was from Marla, and she asked, how does it look for the future of community development block grant funds? And my answer is, I don't know. I mean, I think that was on the chopping block, right? But who knows what's going to happen?
I don't know either, and I assume you're asking. I can only assume you're asking about the use of community development block grants for disaster recovery, or you might be asking more generally. But that really depends on what Congress does. After a disaster, Congress can authorize or appropriate additional funds through the community development block grant to assist with disaster recovery, and that's done on a case-by-case or disaster-by-disaster basis.
Yeah. I guess we'll see in next year's budget what happens. Okay, the next question I might need a little help with. If the property that is subject to buyout is later mitigated, and I'm not sure the context they mean for mitigated, maybe they mean compensatory mitigation, but I'm not sure. Can the property that was originally acquired be sold back to a private entity for development? And
no.
The answer is no. There's deed restrictions that are placed on the property in perpetuity, and they're not allowed to redevelop buyout properties. Right? Okay. Okay, so somebody, and this would be maybe for some folks on the line to answer. The question is, someone familiar with the 319 program or SRFs opine on how EPA provided funding could be leveraged and used by states in conjunction with this program. So if anyone has any thoughts on that, send them along or raise your hand. But I'll move on to the next question, and as we're waiting. Maybe, David, you have thoughts on this, how reinsurance companies are playing a role in the hazard mitigation grant program. Do you know anything about that?
Reinsurance companies?
Mm-hmm.
I'm afraid I don't know that much about reinsurance companies, unfortunately. Not sure how.
That's a good, yeah. I don't know either. That's a good question. I don't know that they are playing a role in the hazard mitigation grant program, but they certainly do in the flood insurance program.
I guess if the reinsurance companies are pulling out of the market in some areas, or if they're shaping the market in some way, it might affect the value of properties. I suppose that's a possibility, but I'm really grasping at straws here.
Yeah. Okay, so here's a question about how we're going to get our guidebook into the hands of communities. I think we certainly have some work to do on outreach for communities. We're still now in the process of getting this back to where we worked and working with our partners at the emergency management agencies at the state level, who are really familiar with all these community buyouts, to try to get it to the communities through them. If you have thoughts, I would love to hear more thoughts on that. David, do you have other ideas?
No, I agree. We'll probably work through existing channels. So, the Floodplain Managers Association, there's different associations for emergency managers, for planners. So we'll work through those channels. Also, webinars and conferences and using our websites and things like that will help. So it'll be a variety or a multitude of different strategies and approaches, but we're always open to suggestions.
And one other audience that I think we're really interested in tapping into is the kind of local conservation organization, watershed group, land trusts, who I think would be a good partner. And if they approached a community with like, hey, we might have a little money, or we might, be able to manage that site, or have you transfer the title to us or lease that site, I think that might be a good way also to target an audience that could then continue the outreach to communities. So we're working a little bit on that now with some land trusts in North Carolina, just started. I'm going to read this from Nancy Green. Did you find any locations where communities considered projections of increased risk of flooding due to changing climate and setting priorities? If so, how do they use information, and how do you think it could be used in the future? I'm not sure. I don't have one off the top of my head, but we should be looking at that. I think that's a good criteria that we'll dig a little bit deeper for. I'm not sure that we found any communities doing that as of now.
There is one example that might help address this question. That's Charlotte, North Carolina. Charlotte took a look at something called build-out. That is, they looked at their current zoning and assumed that over some time period, all the vacant land now will be developed according to its zoning ordinance. And then they calculated how much additional impervious surfaces would be created as a result of that development, and then what would happen to local flooding given the added impervious surfaces. And that went into their delineation of the borders of the 100 and 500-year floodplain. So they looked into the future and said, okay, as we add more homes and streets and sidewalks and driveways and parking areas, that's going to exacerbate flooding in the future, and so they'll adjust the boundaries of their floodplains now in anticipation of the changes later. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that's a really good example, and something that a larger community or city can do that might not be available to smaller communities, but especially one with a program like Charlotte has, that has funding of their own to address some of the things that they find in their planning. That's a good example. And then the last question I have is, can we get a copy of the presentation to share with colleagues? Yes, I'm recording this presentation, and I'll post the PDF of the PowerPoint as well to our website. I posted our website in the chat, but I can give it to you again. It's eli.org/land-biodiversity/floodplain-buyouts. And we should have this posted in the next couple of days. If you can't find it, email me. My email address is on the screen right now, and I will direct you to the right place. So if there's no more questions, we're exactly on time. That's amazing. Thanks to you all again for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Let us know if you have any more thoughts. Again, you can find us at the email addresses on the screen, or suggestions for next steps, or ways to get in touch with communities. We'd appreciate any input you have. Thanks again, all. Have a great day.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.